Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Passionate World Radio Network. Educate, enlighten, entertain. PWTRN is a wholly owned subsidiary of Global Media Network. On today's episode of Lest We Forget Historical, with your host Lillian Cauldwell, we are going to discuss the reasons why Putin felt compelled to wage war against the Ukraine and why several prominent professors from the US say, don't worry, there won't be a World War III. However, one may begin to wonder whether or not they're paying attention to the current news. On February 24th, 2022, Putin/Russia invaded the Ukraine and started a battle. It's now 2024, currently March 13th, and the battle is still being waged with everyone, although not all of NATO, is involved in battling the Russians, although Putin has some allies. Putin gave several reasons. Do they match the reality of why it's important? Yes, because a lot of the reasons that Putin gave is exactly the same reasons why we've been having warfare since the beginning of time. Even the apes fought among themselves. So let's review them as to why Putin says he had to go and invade the Ukraine. Well, the first thing is that Ukraine formerly was part of the Soviet Union, which we now call Russia. And that Russia cares more about the Ukraine than nearby Belarus and other former USSR countries that one finds in Central Asia. Hall said, and I quote, Putin's opinion has always been that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people, that they're part of the Slavic Brotherhood of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Now, Belarus, we already know, is a puppet state of Russia. So for Putin to go in on a military war would be pointless. Whereas Ukraine wants to become a member of NATO, and more importantly, it has formed allies with Western Europe. Professor Brian Taylor, a Russian politics expert, noted that the invasion of Ukraine reflects Putin's grievances that have been brewing for a long time. So one could say this is his way of throwing a temper tantrum. Putin believes that Russia has the right to rule Ukraine, that Russian and Ukrainians are one nation and one people. They were illegitimately and artificially separated when the Soviet Union collapsed. And Putin blames the West for trying to pull Ukraine out of Russia's natural friendship, Taylor said. At the start of the invasion, Putin stated and blamed NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe for forcing his hand. And he uses that excuse whenever he needs to find a scapegoat for what he's done, because Putin is never wrong. Most conquerors are never wrong. Napoleon would never admit. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hitler, they all admit that they're above the law and they can do what they want. The world owes them. Hall said that the idea that NATO is threatening Russia by expanding towards its borders is very much part of the Russian propaganda narrative. So who are you going to believe? If that's the only, quote, fake, unquote, news, then one can get what is you as a Russian citizen led to believe. Well, 1984 comes to mind, but we won't go into that. He also pointed out, Hall, that NATO simply doesn't expand, but that countries need to apply to join, usually motivated by an outside perceived threat. And the threat often comes from Russia. Lithuania's prime minister, for example, told Insider in February that her country joined NATO because of Putin. Big hammer. But Putin has reversed it and is playing the blame game instead. Do you really want a world leader playing the blame game? What are they, toddlers? Taylor says he doesn't see a coherent explanation for how NATO's alleged expansion could lead to war. Before Finland joined NATO earlier this year, since 2004, and even then it was a pretty tiny country, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. He also said that NATO didn't put additional troops in the region. So it wasn't like the addition of those countries created this military force on Russia's doorstep. In fact, Taylor said that the US was cutting back on the size of its armed forces in Europe until pro-Russian forces occupied parts of Ukraine in 2014. But Putin likes blaming other people for his problems. He said that Putin is great at throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. According to Graham, there's no evidence that Putin was under any public pressure to invade Ukraine, which suggests that it's a personal between Putin and what the Ukrainians dare to do. All three of these experts says Putin's desire to be revered in history books lightly motivated him to attack. An interesting thought. That's what our presidents of the United States like to be remembered for, is their legacy. Hall said that Putin's anxiety is around, am I going to be a footnote in Russian history, or are they going to write books about me like they do Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Stalin? I don't think so. The jury's still out. Taylor agrees that Putin sees himself as a great historic Russian leader, restoring Russian lands. And at the age of 70, he may not live forever. He wants what I said previously, a legacy. And he reminds everybody that's what the Russian Tsar did. They expanded Russian territory. Well, if that's true, then why did they shoot the imperial family in 1919? And there's only one other option left for Putin to do, a military one. Part of the reason that former President Trump got into power was he was very friendly towards Putin. And he also publicly criticized NATO, which meant that Putin was waiting for NATO to explode from within. And then you always have COVID-19 to bring into the arena, which put Putin and Russia in isolation from the rest of the world. And Graham also added that Putin's recent tendency towards megalomania had been exacerbated by him being in extreme isolation, i.e., ignored by the rest of the world. So it kind of makes you think about why Putin has, or did Putin have, a legitimate reason for invading Ukraine. You want to know why this might lead to a world war? Well, think about it. You have Russia, Ukraine. You have Belarus, who's aching to get involved. You have the North Korean dictator. You have North Vietnam. Well, it's not as bad as North Korea, who really is itching. Of course, Cuba's pretty much out of the picture. Then you have Hamas, who attacked Israel. That's the second front. First front is Russia. Second front is Israel. The third front is the joint drone power between England and the United States that are bombing ships in the Far East because they're making problems for transport ships going through with supplies. So we just need another front. And if the thought of insurrection in the United States might evolve, that would create a World War III situation, because now you're fighting on 4 fronts. Can the United States afford that? And there are tensions that did not exist before. Gaza, the Ukraine, and what I just mentioned. In January, the ongoing head of the British Army, General Patrick Sanders, said that the U.S. citizens should be prepared to form a citizen army in the event of war between NATO members and Russia, invoking similar policy of conscription used in World War I and World War II. Between the current geopolitical situation and the events, highlight the role of competing alliances and economic tensions and disputes over borders and territory. A tale as old as time. Think about all those military strategies and mini wars you had to learn in elementary, junior, and senior high school. And if you really loved history, you took it in college. Hasn't changed much, has it? A spokesperson from Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called them not helpful about the remarks from Downing Street. Concerns about a new global war originating from conflicts in Europe and the Middle East have continued to circulate. An analysis from Bloomberg shows that references to World War III in news stories recently hit a 16-month high. So, are we really working up to World War III? Texas A&M Today asked Dr. Jason Castillo and Dr. John Schrussler, associate professors of international affairs at Texas A&M University's Bush School of Government and Public Service. They're co-directors of the Bush School, the Albritton Center for Grand Strategy. And you're wondering, well, what makes a world war? The specific term world war applies to armed conflicts between major world powers spanning multiple regions of the globe. Therefore, our notions of what a world war might look like are largely dependent on who the country is. Another way of looking at it is a war in which multiple great powers compete for position on the world stage, and armed disputes over territory and resources are more common. Castillo says what we are seeing is a return to great power politics. In concrete terms, this new reality means the United States will have have to make hard choices about where and when it uses military power. If we don't make choices, we risk bankrupting ourselves, finding non-essential wars that weakens us or both. So, in a nutshell, are we going to have a World War III? Well, like everything else, it's relative and it depends on who's saying what. If you listen to Putin, he's all ready to jump in. If you listen to the United States, they're taking a wait and see attitude, the same way that former President Roosevelt took a wait and see attitude for World War II. And although people claim it was Pearl Harbor who started us on the road to World War II, Roosevelt was well aware of the mood of the country, and he was just waiting for permission from the American people so he could wage war. Something to think about. Thank you very much for listening to Lest We Forget Historical with host Lillian Cauldwell. You can see this interview that I've done, more like a discussion, all over again on youtube.com/PWR Network _PW Talk Radio, on passionateworldtalkradio.com, on iTunes, iHeart, to name a few, Spreaker, and on April 2nd and on April 5th, PWTRN is offering free master classes on Empower Your Voice, Unlocking Your Podcasting Potential. April 2nd is at 7 p.m. Eastern for those who work during the day. And on Friday, April 5th, it starts at 4 p.m. for those who don't. Free masterclass. To sign up, please go and visit the blog at passionateworldtalkradio.com, and you will see the links, separate links for each webinar on April 2nd and on April 5th. Also, if you're interested in becoming a podcaster, then you'll be delighted to hear that we have a few openings for passionate people who want or already are podcasters. Please contact me at pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com. Attention, Lillian, your name, your email address, the name of your podcast, and 3 episodes of your podcast. Or you can text 484-364-1032. I want to thank you all very much for joining us today, and hope you join us next week on Lest We Forget Historical.